The old ones tell us that in the long ago time, Gliscobby was born in the land of the Abenaki, the people of the dawn. Some say he was born here. Others say he arrived in a great stone canoe covered with trees. But everyone agreed there was not one place in the land of the Abenaki where the hand of Gliscobby could not be seen. His hand was seen in the mountains, the hills and the rocks, the great lakes, the rivers and the streams. And it was Gliscobby that made things. The first thing he made were the little people, the ones that dwell inside the rocks. And then he made the creatures, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that walk. And when everything was made, he made his favorite creature, man. He took his bow and his arrow and he drew his bow tight and he let the arrow fly and it hit the bark of the ash tree. And out of the bark came man. But at first, man did not know anything he needed to know. Gliscobby had to teach him everything he needed to know. He taught him about the plants. Which ones were good to eat, which ones were not good to eat, which ones, if you were feeling sick, would make you feel better. He taught him the name of every creatures, the ones that fly, the ones that walk, the ones that swim, which ones were good to eat, which ones were not good to eat. He taught him how to make his bow and arrows and his spears and his fishing weirs and his canoes and his lodges. He taught him the name of every single star in the sky so that man would know how to come and go and find his way, and taught him about the Great Spirit's road which stretches from one end of the sky to the other. There was just one problem. When Gliscobby first made the animals, he made them very, very, very big. And he began to worry about these great, big, huge animals. And his favorite creature, man, who was so small. So he began to question every single animal as to how they would behave if they saw a man on the road. He saw a squirrel and he said, "Squirrel, if you happen to see a man on the road, what would you do?" And the squirrel said, "I'd tear the trees down on him." Back then, squirrel was as big as a wolf. Gliscobby could see that squirrel was too big. Squirrel had too much power. So he took squirrel into his arms and he patted him down and patted him down and patted him down till he is the size he is today. And now when a squirrel sees a man, he runs chitter, chitter, chitter right up a tree. Gliscobby saw Moose and asked Moose, "If you happen to see a man on the road, what would you do?" And the moose said, "I'd tear the trees down on him." Back then, Moose was as big as a pine tree. Gliscobby could see that Moose was too big. Moose had too much power. So he changed his size until he is the size he is today. And now when a moose sees a man on the road, he goes running, crashing, bellowing through the forest. And then the great white bear, Gliscobby asked, what would he do? And the great white bear said, "Eat him." Gliscobby could see that the great white bear was too big and had too much power. So he made the great white bear go far, far, far to the north, where he would not see very many men at all. And so it was in the long ago time. Gliscobby questioned every single animal. And depending on whether or not they could answer with respect, he would change their size as needed. Now that story is thought to be an Algonquin Paleo-Indian geomythology story. Do you know what that is? You may find as you grow old, there's many times you know what something is. You just don't know it yet. How many of you saw the movie Ice Age? Who saw the movie Ice Age 2? The Meltdown. Now, Algonquin were the Native Americans that lived in this part of the world. Paleo-Indian, the time period from the movie Ice Age, that's Paleo-Indian. And geomythology means a story about the land. Very old story, isn't it? From the last Ice Age. Told from parent to child, from parent to child, from parent to child, all through time. Until you can read it in a book today. Now there are as many stories as there are stars in the sky. But there's different kinds of stories. And I'm going to tell you a few today. Think for a moment. Do you think squirrels used to be as big as wolves? No. No? In the movie Ice Age, what was that animal with the big long nose? A mammoth. In the days of mammoths and woolly mammoths and mastodons, squirrels were as big as wolves. They're not anymore though, are they? It changed. Things changed. Moose in the story, it says it was as big as a pine tree. Now there was megafauna moose, which means really big animal, megafauna. There was a megafauna moose. It's a really old story. Maybe the trees weren't quite as tall as they are now. But there's not megafauna moose anymore. There's just moose. What do you think the great white bear was?
The polar bear.
That's what I thought too. And you know what I learned in reading and researching and doing homework? The great white bear was the glacier that once covered New Hampshire. But we don't have a glacier in New Hampshire anymore, do we? But what was left behind from those glaciers? Rocks, 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 rocks everywhere. Who has rocks in their yard? Who has seen those rock walls all over the place? You imagine being a farmer and having to pick up every single one of those rocks? That's a lot of work just to plant something, and so they'd make walls everywhere so they'd know where their fields and their property was. Wow, lots of rocks. What do you think the Great Spirit's road was, which stretched from one end of the sky to the other? I'll give you a hint. Nighttime? A candy bar? The Milky Way.
The Milky Way.
So all kinds of things can be in a story that you're not so sure about. How many of you know where the Lawrence River is? Do you and me know where the Merrimack River is? Who likes to run? Who likes to play soccer? Yeah, things like that. Now there's a story from about 10,000 years ago that says that moose, megafauna moose, right, big moose, loved to run. He was always wanting to run. He ran here, he ran there, he ran everywhere, and he always wanted to race everybody. And one day he had been running and running and racing so much, he began to drink the water in the Merrimack River. He was so thirsty, he drank and 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 all the water started disappearing. In real life, the water was moving into the glacier. And all the animals were worried Moose was gonna drink up all the water. What would they drink? What would the plants do? What would the fish do? And they had a big council, and everyone tried to think of what they could do to get Moose to stop drinking all the water. No one could come up with a plan until finally Black Fly had an idea. And Black Fly flew over to Moose and started flying up his nose. And he started biting him on his eyelid and his cheeks and all over. And Moose would shake his head and stomp his foot. And finally, that Black Fly was biting him so much he started stomping around. And all of a sudden, the ground began to shake. And a huge wall of water came rushing out to sea. And to this day, we have all the jumbled rocks in the river, right? You remember in Ice Age 2 when there was that big, huge ice dam and it got the crack in it? That's what that's describing in a different story form. Now, can you imagine being brave enough to move far, far away? Just to pick up and go someplace you've never been before? I think that's very brave. And this story comes from 1766. Do you ever help your mother with chores at home?
Yeah, sort of.
Do you make up your bed? Do you sort your clothes for the laundry?
No.
Do you put your clothes away after they're clean?
Yeah.
Help do dishes?
Yeah.
Things like that? Chores, huh? Now, it just so happened in 1766 in the Pioneer Valley of Massachusetts, there lived a Mr. Brown with his wife and their 2 children, John and Jane. John was 9, Jane was 7. And he had heard there was very good land to be had in New Hampshire. And so he got their wagon and he piled it high with everything they could carry. And the cow was tied on to the back and the horse began to pull. And for all spring, after the ground had grown solid, after the spring snows had melted, far until most of the summer had passed, they traveled. It took that long to get from western Massachusetts to New Hampshire. And there he found just the place. It was in Meredith, New Hampshire, overlooking Lake Winnipesaukee. And there he decided he would build his new cabin. Now, have you ever heard, "Not now, honey, I'm busy"? Yeah. Have you ever heard, "No, you can't do that, it's dangerous"?
Yes.
You know why your parents say things like that? Because it's probably true. You imagine having to build your house from nothing? All of those trees had to be felled, axed, cut down. And a tree falling is pretty dangerous. So time and time again, all summer long, John and Jane were told, "Not now, go find something to do, we're busy." Dangerous work. They helped when they could. But most of the time they had to entertain themselves. And so John and Jane explored the forest around their home. Soon they knew where every boulder was. They knew all the different kinds of trees and the big ones and the small ones and where everything was pretty much. Soon John was able to whistle and squirrels would come up and take nuts right out of his hand. Well, time and time again, Mr. Brown would have to go into town to get more supplies because they were still building. But finally, they finished that shack or cabin, and they built a little lean-to right next to it for the cow and the horse. And then on one of his trips, later in the summer, early fall, he went to town and he came back with Yankee gold. 2 piglets. 2 piglets for John to take care of. It was his job. That meant no matter how hard and cold and hungry the winter became, they would still have some meat to eat. And John was given that job of taking care of those 2 piglets. Soon he had them coming just like they were dogs. Well, time and again, they went to store. Their mother worked hard preparing all the food that they would need to see them through the long winter ahead. And his dad needed to go back into town one more time. The trees, almost all the leaves had fallen. The wind was blowing cold and soon the snows would fall. And Mrs. Brown had one friend that lived not far. And she wanted to visit her before they were snowed in for the winter. She had heard she'd been feeling ill and she wanted to pay her a visit. And so Mr. Brown said, "Well, come with me. You can visit your friend while I go into town for supplies." But that meant leaving John and Jane home alone. And she didn't like that idea. But John said, "Oh, Mom, we'll be fine." And Jane said, "Oh, Mom, we'll be fine." And Mr. Brown said, "Oh, honey, they'll be fine. There's mush in the pot on the fire. If they get hungry, they can dip some out for themselves. They'll be fine." And even though it was past her better judgment, she finally agreed, and Mr. and Mrs. Brown rode off. And there was John and Jane. They stayed close to the house. They didn't go wandering. They weren't foolish. They weren't afraid of the forest. They knew it well because they played there all the time, but, you know, they were home alone. And then about noon, Jane got hungry, and so they were going to go into the cabin to dip out some of that mush to eat for lunch. And they were walking into the cabin when all of a sudden, roar! There was a great huge roar. And when they turned and looked, there was a bear, and it had one of the piglets in its mouth, and it was running away into the forest. They ran into that cabin and slammed the door and barred it. But that meant one of the pigs was gone, and it was John's job to care for the pigs. And he thought surely he could save at least one of them, and he was going to go back out into that pen to try to find it. But they needed a plan. And the plan was Jane would stand there right by the door. John would get the pig, and he'd run inside, and they'd slam the door and bar it. Jane couldn't carry the pig. She could hold it, but she couldn't run with it. It was too big. Only John could do it. So there was Jane at the door for the ready. John went out to the pen, and he began to call the piglet's name. Couldn't find it. He kept searching and looking. There were leaves and sticks. That poor piglet had been so terrified. It had burrowed deep in, but finally he was able to clear away the brush, find the piglet, tucked it under his arm, and began to run as fast as he could back into the cabin. And of course the piglet was still afraid of the bear, and he didn't like being squashed under John's arm. And then the piglet, when he was running, was going meh. But that piglet squealing caught the attention of the bear. There were two piglets, and he wanted dessert. John barely was able to get into the cabin. Jane had yelled at him, "Run!" He finally got in. They slammed the door. They barred it. And then they went and sat side by side with the piglet in their lap in the corner of the cabin, when all of a sudden they started hearing. It was that bear sniffing around the door. And then the bear started throwing itself against the door. It was barred. But then they started hearing that bear sniffing underneath the door. And soon he started to claw underneath that door. Soon they could see its whole arms and claws, and then that nose. And soon the head. There was a bear attached to the head. Jonathan was terrified. What was he to do? Do you know the story of the three little pigs?
Yes.
I don't know if Jonathan thought of the three little pigs, but John was English descent. He'd probably heard it when he was little. And I don't even know if he thought about it. All of a sudden he looked, the rifle, the musket, his father had it. He looked around the room, and the only thing in the room was that big pot of boiling mush by the fire. And he took that long serving spoon, and he scooped out a big glob, a whole ladle full, big ladle of that mush. And when that bear's head came out from under the door, he took it, went splat, right on the bear's head. And the bear backed up. Roar! And everything went quiet for a little while. It just made the bear mad. And he started throwing his body against the door and started digging underneath that door again. John didn't know what else to do. He grabbed another ladle full of that mush and splattered it all over the bear's face. And the bear backed away, howling. And everything went quiet again. But it had been quiet before. And so for the rest of the day, John and Jane sat together, huddled in the corner, holding that piglet, when finally you could hear the wagon approaching. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were on their way home. And as they drew close to the cabin, Mrs. Brown called out, "What is that? What is that?" There was a dark shape right outside the door. Mr. Brown stopped that wagon, climbed down, and with his musket in hand, gently approached quietly. And that's where he found it. A bear. It was dead. And inside was John and Jane and a piglet. And because that 9-year-old boy was able to think quickly and was very brave, he saved himself, his sister, and the piglet. They were safe inside and very hungry. But that story is true, and it has been passed down all the way through time to where you can read that today. Now, when you leave, you'll be taking with you a bookmark. And on the front side, some wicked cool books. How many of you know the dangerous book for boys? Who knows the daring book for girls? I was a bit of a tomboy. I'd want both books. Lots of wicked cool stuff. And at the bottom, there's 2 stories, The Bear That Heard Crying and Thanks to the Animals. And both of those are New England adventures, true stories that happened in the long ago time. And on the other side are questions, the kinds of questions you ask yourself, your friends, your mom, your dad, your aunt, your uncle, your grandma, your grandpa. Who still has a great-grandma and a great-grandpa? You never know when you might be the keeper of a family story, because every family has its heroes and adventurers. Now, you can tell I kind of talk funny. I grew up in West Texas, but I love living in New England. There's trees everywhere, and there's really water in the rivers. It's not like that in West Texas. And the history is so long. Our house was built in 1774, and having had 3 children, and they all studied history too, it's very interesting to learn stories. And this was one of the first stories I learned about the American Revolution. Now, Miriam Gray was the youngest of 9 children. And her parents could not have been more proud. As she grew, at school, she was an excellent student. She always studied hard, and she always behaved. At home, she could spin almost as well as her mother. Her sisters were so jealous. And she was so kind and gentle with all of the animals on their farm that her brothers were jealous too. She was always able to fill up her milk pail first, and all of the animals. She took such good care of them. There wasn't a better farmer in all the neighborhood. She was a very beautiful young woman with long black hair and dark brown eyes. But there was just one thing. She had few friends. Everyone in those days was so superstitious, and they had remembered how her mother had cursed Martha Collier in the witch trials in Salem, and how Martha had met her end on Gallows Hill. And everyone was convinced that the witch's curse would follow her mother as well as her. And so, children were not encouraged to play with her. And even though she was an excellent student and she was kind and nice to everyone, by the time she'd grown to be a young woman, even though many young men thought she was beautiful and would have married her, still they were discouraged. She lived in Chickasaw, Massachusetts, just up the river. In Shawsheen, there lived a Benjamin Fay. He was the oldest son of Solomon Fay. And when it was time for him to go out into the world and make his own way, with his father's encouragement, they discussed it, and he bought himself a mill right there on the water's edge. In those days, there weren't that many roads, and everyone used the rivers, the water, as a road. And that mill, where it was, farmers from far and wide would bring their corn to be ground, and he had a prosperous business. And all of the old women would tease him, so like, oh, Benjamin, you need to find yourself a wife to help you. And he said, mm-hmm, and who would be taking care of the mill while I went looking for a wife? But they liked to tease him. And the time passed until everyone noticed that on Sundays, he kept getting in his canoe and paddling away. Everyone wondered what he was up to. Was he working on Sunday? Until one Sunday, he came in his canoe with other canoes following. He embarked there on the water's edge, got out, and all the townspeople had gathered. He said, well, you kept telling me to go find a wife, and here she is. And there stood Miriam Gray. Her father had bought her a beautiful scarlet red cloak to offset her hair and eyes as a wedding gift. And there she stood. The daughter of the cursed woman, wearing red like the red coats. The townspeople had little to say. She was basically shunned, even though she had moved. Benjamin didn't care. He loved his wife. And he got very angry, like he would make them respect his wife. But she said no. Superstition takes time to pass. Just leave it be. By our actions, people will know who we are. That winter came early, and it was cold and it was bitter. And in those days, they took such good care of their forest. You could only cut down so much wood. If you cut down too much wood, where would the forest be? Where would the animals go? And so you could only have so much wood in your house. And it was a long, early, cold, and bitter winter, and soon people had run through their wood, and they were freezing, and they were hungry, and people began to grumble about Miriam Fay. It was her fault. They hadn't had such problems before. Soon spring came, everything grew. It was a wonderful summer. The rivers filled with water. The crops were great. And then winter came again. Except that winter, hardly any snow fell at all winter long. They had plenty of wood, but when it came time for the spring melt, the water in the rivers was low. The crops did not fare well. There wasn't even enough water in the river for people to come and have their corn grilled or ground at the mill. And so for a time, the mill had to close. And the people began to grumble about Miriam Fay. Not long after, a horrible sickness spread through the village, and all the children became ill. And everyone would say, Miriam, children aren't sick. Well, no one ever went to visit her. That might be why her children weren't sick. But working in her fireplace, she put together a medicine for her children, and she thought perhaps that's why they didn't get sick. And she made a lot of it. And she would go from neighbor to neighbor offering to help. But suspicious, they would turn her away until finally, desperate, their own children sick, they accepted her help, and all the children got well. Do you think the neighbors were kind? Some would say, well, it's because no one visited that's why her children didn't get sick. But others would say, maybe it's good for a witch to do something, some good turn. They treated her terribly. And then, soon enough, here came the war for the independence. Everyone gathered to try to decide how they would fight the British. And Miriam came as well, asking what she could do. And everyone just looked at her, and she said, and away she went. It didn't matter that she had stopped wearing that red cloak ages ago. It did not matter that she was the first person to stop drinking tea. She was still being shunned, but she had a plan. And the villagers noticed that early in the morning, she could be seen riding away out of town. And everyone was curious about what she was doing. In those days, there were safety committees, and everyone was always watching to see who was a traitor. And she had put on that red cloak. And she had ridden into the enemy camp. And there she spoke with the British officers, saying how stubborn these Yankees were. And they wanted to know if she had information for them. She said, well, maybe, for the right price. And so she and the officers, they talked until they came up with a proper reward. And she told him that she herself would lead them to a cave where munitions and food was all stored. And they were to meet at the river the next night. And she met them, wearing her red cloak with a lantern. The British officers roared up. She said, tie your horses to the tree and leave them here. She had taken a plank and thrown it across the river. And with her lantern leading the way, the British officers followed her. They crossed that plank and walked into the woods until they went deep, deep into a cave. Officers there with her when all of a sudden her lantern went out. And under the cloak of darkness, she stole away. She crossed through the forest, across that plank, kicked the plank into the water so it floated away, grabbed all of the money bags off the officers' horses and shooed them away, mounted her own horse, and rode like the wind the rest of the way home. Now the officers, tricked by a woman, when they got back to their encampment, they just had to admit the money was lost, but they didn't want to speak about it anymore. They were so embarrassed. But Miriam rode straight to the meeting house, and there at the table where everyone had gathered, she dumped out all those bags of gold coins. That was enough money to outfit every soldier in the village with munitions and food and clothes, everything they would need to fight the American Revolution. From that day forward, no one held in their mind any more suspicion about Miriam Fay. From that day forward, she was known as a very brave patriot. And the towns, Chochiquik and Shawsheen, are now Andover and Bedford, New Hampshire. Now this story cracks me up. When people came to the New World, it was inevitable. And when people came to the New World, they brought their stories. The story actually comes from Puerto Rico, but it can be found everywhere through the area. Parts of it are African, parts of it are Taino-Indian, parts of it are European. But everyone brought their stories, and together they created a new story for the New World. And this is it. Rabbit and Tiger, they were friends. Amigos, well, sort of. They knew each other really well because Rabbit was always playing tricks on Tiger, and Tiger was always looking for Rabbit so he could eat him. One morning, Rabbit woke up. He was so hungry, the front part of his front was stuck to the back part of his back. He was starving to death, and he sat there looking out on the land going, what am I going to eat for breakfast? Well, it just so happened that on this very day, Tiger had his cheeses, and he was walking into the marketplace to sell his cheese. And Rabbit thought, I can trick Tiger. So Rabbit got up on the road and laid down as if he was dead. Well, here came Tiger walking on the way to the market with his cheeses, and he saw that dead rabbit right there in the road. He thought, Rabbit. But he had his cheeses. He had to get to market. He didn't have time to stop and skin and cook a rabbit. So he looked up the road and he looked down the road so he'd remember where that rabbit was. And he just kept right on walking. Well, as soon as he was out of sight, Rabbit jumped up. And instead of following the road, he hopped down the hill to a second place in the road. Because that road kept going back and forth down the steep hill. And he laid down in the road in a new spot as if he was dead. Well, here came Tiger. thinking about rabbit. And right there in the middle of the road was another rabbit. He didn't have time to stop and eat rabbit. So he looked up in the road and he looked down the road so he'd remember exactly where that rabbit was. And he kept right on walking. Well, as soon as he had gotten out of sight, Rabbit hopped up and jumped down that hill to a third place in the road and laid down as if he was dead. Well, here came Tiger. His stomach was rumbling and grumbling, and his mouth was juicy, and he was thinking, rabbit pie, rabbit stew, rabbit drumstick. So he liked rabbit. And when he was walking, and right there was a third rabbit. Tiger said, that's it, I can't take it anymore. He threw down his cheeses and ran back up the road to get to those other 2 rabbits because he was going to have a 3-rabbit feast. But when he found those other places in the road, he kept looking for the rabbits and he couldn't find the rabbits. And he thought, someone else came by, saw those rabbits and ate them. So he went back to where he left his cheeses. Not only was his cheese gone, so was that rabbit. And Tiger knew once again he had been tricked by Rabbit. He had one thing on his mind, finding that rabbit so he could eat him. Rabbit did not waste any time. He grabbed those bags of cheese. He took off running until he came to a great boulder. And there in the shade of that boulder, he opened up those bags of cheese and he started scarfing them. He didn't even chew. He was just chewing up that cheese, swallowing pieces whole. He was so full of cheese, he had cheese bumps sticking out of his fur. And there he was all full of cheese when all of a sudden he saw Tiger. Now, Tiger's a hunting animal. He just followed that rabbit. And there was Tiger. He had to think of something fast. He was so full of cheese, he couldn't outrun him, so he thought very quickly. And when Tiger came up, he went, "Arr!" And Rabbit said, hey, Tiger. Well, this was a very unusual greeting. I mean, you know, big teeth. Usually when people saw a tiger, they went, ah! And they ran away. And Rabbit wasn't running, so he knew something must be terrible wrong. He said, what's wrong? And he goes, oh, this boulder's rolling down the hill and it's going to squash everybody flat and I can't hold it much more. It was shaking. Tiger said, well, I'm big, I'm strong, I can hold it. He goes, well, if you hold it, I'll go get help. So Tiger got in front of that boulder and he braced himself. He put his back against it. And, he was holding that boulder up. And Tiger said, keep it from rolling, I'll be right back. Rabbit was gone. Do you think he went to the village to get help? No. He just left that poor Tiger there, pushed up against that great big boulder, going, trying to keep it from rolling down the hill. And the sun kept getting higher and hotter, and his muscles were shaking, and he thought, well, if this boulder is going to roll down the hill, at least it doesn't have to squash me flat first. And he got real brave. He said, 1, 2, 3, and he jumped out. That boulder didn't go anywhere. And that's when Tiger knew once again that Rabbit had tricked him. And he had one thing on his mind, finding that rabbit so he could eat him. Well, he thought instead of chasing him, he would just go to Rabbit's house. So he went to Rabbit's house. He would just wait for him there. Of course, Rabbit's house is this big and Tiger's are this big. You could see him everywhere, so he thought he better get inside a rabbit's house. The tail was easy, it slipped right in. But getting the rest of him in, he had to push and squeeze, and squash and squeeze and push and push and push till he was finally inside Rabbit's house. Well, here came Rabbit, coming home. Hey, you smell that? Oh, that smells like Tiger. was Tiger in his house. He had to think fast. So he got kind of close to his house, but not so close he couldn't run around. And he said, my house, is there anybody in my house? No answer. Then he launched into the second half of his plan. There must be something terrible wrong, because every time I come home and I call out to my house, is anybody in my house always answered, and my house didn't answer. I better try again. My house, is anybody home? And Tiger said, everything's fine, Rabbit, come on in. Ha! Tiger, houses don't speak. And Rabbit ran away.
And there was Tiger stuck inside of his house. It took him all day long to drink out.
And when he finally got out, he was so thirsty. He went straight to the river to get a drink. Guess who he saw there? Rabbit. And he snuck up on Rabbit just the way tigers know how to do and said, hey, Rabbit! Rabbit nearly jumped out of his skin. He's like, oh, hi, Tiger. He goes, I'm gonna eat you. And he said, well, you might as well. I'm so afraid. He's like, what? He goes, well, I was gonna tie myself to the tree. Well, why would you tie yourself to a tree? Well, because a hurricane's coming. Tiger knew all about hurricanes. They blew hard. They knocked down trees. He didn't want to blow away either. And he said, oh, Rabbit, please tie me to the tree. He goes, well, we promise not to. I promise, just please tie me to the tree. He said, all right. So Tiger stood up nice and tall right up against the tree. And Rabbit took a bunch of vine ropes and he wrapped him around and around and around and around and around, tied knots up all over the place, and asked Tiger, do you feel secure? He goes, yep. I can't even hardly breathe. He said, good, here comes the hurricane. Rabbit ran away, and there was Tiger stuck in that tree. He was tied so tight, he wasn't gonna blow away. And that's when he noticed there weren't any clouds in the sky. There wasn't even a breeze. There was no hurricane, and that rabbit had tricked him again. It took him days to wiggle out, to get skinny enough to get out from all of those ropes. Well, in the meantime, Rabbit had gone into town and had bragged to everyone about all the tricks he had played on Tiger. He said, that tiger, I could ride that tiger right through the center of town in a saddle with reins and a bit. And well, no one believed me. He goes, I bet I can. They said, well, we'll believe it when we see it. So Rabbit had to come up with a plan. And what he did is he wrote a lovely letter to Tiger. He said, dear Tiger, I'm so sorry for all the tricks I've played on you. The only way to let you know that I truly am sorry is to invite you to my house to eat me for dinner. Now, when Tiger got the note, he thought, finally, and he went straight to Rabbit's house. And when he got to Rabbit's house, there was Rabbit in bed. He goes, come on, Rabbit, let's go. You're mine. Dinner now. And he goes, okay. Achoo! Second part of the plan. And Tiger said, what's wrong with you? I don't know. I think I have a cold. What do you mean you have a cold? I don't know. I just, achoo! He goes, well, I can't eat you if you're sick. I eat you, I'll get sick. And he goes, well, I guess you could just take me home with you and eat me later. All right, come on, let's go. Because I'm so tired, I don't think I can walk. I need to ride on your back. Fine. And so Tiger picked up that rabbit, put him on his back, and started walking out. He hadn't gone 3 steps, and poof, Rabbit fell up. Oh, Tiger. Achoo! I'm so weak, I can't stay on your back. I think I need a saddle. A saddle? I don't have a saddle. It's okay, I do. And he did. And so a saddle was put on to Tiger. And Rabbit got into the saddle. And Tiger started walking away. And he hadn't gone very far at all. But the rabbit fell out again. What is wrong with you? I got you. He goes, I know. I'm so sick I don't think I can stay in the saddle unless I have reins and a bit. Reins and a bit? I don't have a reins and a bit. And Rabbit said, it's okay, I do. And he did. and that bit was put into Tiger's mouth, and the reins went over Tiger's head, and Rabbit was in the saddle, and he said, "Yeah!" And that Tiger started running like the wild thing he was, and there was Rabbit in the saddle, rode right through town. Everybody saw him, could not believe it. Got on the other side of the town, slipped out of the saddle, and went into town to collect his bets because he was bragging. He rode Tiger through town in a saddle with reins and a bit. That Tiger just kept right on running. Now, I've never seen a tiger with a saddle on and reins and a bit. Have you? So I figured, just like those ropes, he finally got out of them. But one thing is true. To this very day, Tiger is still looking for Rabbit. And if he ever catches him, he's gonna eat him. Now, how many of you get to visit your grandparents? Oh, I miss my grandparents. They're all gone now because I'm so old. When I was little like you, I loved to visit my grandparents. And on my mother's side of the family, it was Grandma and Grandpa. But on my father's side of the family, it was Mama Duck and Dodo. When you're the oldest grandchild, you get to name them. And my grandma and grandfather, they lived in the town. But my Mama Duck and Dodo, they lived on a real live ranch. And can you imagine what I got for my birthday? I got a horse. A real horse. It wasn't a pony. I got a real horse, and I got everything. I had real cowboy blue jeans that zipped right up the front like my Uncle John is. In those days, all the girls' blue jeans zipped up the side. I didn't want those kind. I wanted cowboy blue jeans. I wanted to go without a shirt like my Uncle John did. My mother wouldn't let me. So I had one of those little cowboy shirts that had the pearl snaps down the front, right? I had real leather chaps, red cowboy boots, a red cowboy hat, spurs, saddlebags, 6-shooters. I was too much. My first order of business every day was to get that horse saddled so I could just spend my day riding like the wind up and down the road. Now, my birthday was in the spring. And in the spring, on a real working cattle ranch, they had all these calves. You like to drink milk? If you drank milk anywhere near around Fort Worth, Texas, you drank Boswell's milk, and my grandmother was the youngest Boswell. And all of those cows had calves. And all of those cows needed to be rounded up, and they were planning a real live rodeo right there in the big corral. And I wanted to ride. I wanted to be part of it. You know what they told me? You're too little. I just turned 6 years old. And you know what I did? I threw a fit. Have you ever thrown a fit before? Oh, that's good. Oh, I was awful. I screamed and yelled and cried, and I made such a scene. You know what they did? They sent me to stay with my other grandmother in the city, and I missed the rodeo, the big roundup altogether. They had a chuck wagon, the whole bit. I was so sad, and I was complaining, telling my grandmother about it, and you know what she told me? She said, well, now, wagon rides can be dangerous. And she told me a story about her when she was little. When she was born, she was 3 years old when her mother died. And that left her with 2 older brothers, but all those children to take care of by herself. Her father was so sad, especially with the little girl. Her aunts and uncles took turns raising her as if she was their own child. But then her father remarried, and she was sent for. And she was put on the back of a covered wagon. That's how old this story is. And on this covered wagon, she was traveling across the Texas prairie to go back to the big city in Fort Worth to be with her father and brothers again. Do you know any 3-year-olds? Do you know what it's like when a 3-year-old doesn't take a nap? She was in the back of that wagon taking a nap when all of a sudden that wagon wheel landed in a great big hole in the road, in the trail, and that wagon bounced. If you hit a chug hole in your car before and the whole car bounces, sometimes you lose a hubcap. When that wagon bounced, you know what happened? She got jumped. She got thrown right out of that wagon onto her head. And they didn't know she'd fallen out of the wagon, and the wagon kept right on going. There she was, 3 years old, in the wilds, and the wagon was leaving. Even though she was only 3, she was smart enough to think, and she walked in the tracks, the trail that those wagon wheels left, and soon they realized she was missing. And they turned around, and they came back, and they found her. Whew, I wouldn't be here today. So she told me wagons can be dangerous. Well, when I got sent back to the ranch, all the calves had been rounded up, but now they were having a real live rodeo. And you know what I wanted to do? Ride in the rodeo. And you know what they told me? You're too little. And so that night I went to my grandmother, Mama Duck, and I said, oh, Mama Duck, can I ride in the rodeo with the cowboys? And she said, no. I said, oh, Mama Duck, can I please ride with the cowboys? And she said, no. Mama Duck, ride in the rodeo with the cowboys. And she said, no, the boogeyman will get you. Right. Every single night I asked my poor grandmother, oh, Mama Duck, can I ride with the cowboys? And she'd say, no. Until finally one of the cowboys fixed a rope and he said, if you can learn how to lasso this fence post, we'll let you ride. And he fixed me a lasso and he assigned me a fence post, and for 3 more days I practiced until I could lasso that fence post every single time. And they let me ride in the rodeo. There we were in the big corral. The mothers were at one end and the babies at the other, and they'd let out the little calves and they'd run to their mothers, and the cowboys would ride after them. I rode after that little calf. I lassoed that calf, tied the rope around the saddle horn. Ta-da! It was now official. I was a real life cowboy because I could lasso, and I wanted one thing. I wanted to sleep in the cowboy bunkhouse. Who has twin beds, like bunk beds? Nobody had bunk beds but the U.S. Army and real-life cowboy bunkhouses. And I wanted to sleep in the bunkhouse like a real-life cowboy. And I asked my grandmother, Mama Duck, oh, Mama Duck, can I sleep in the bunkhouse with the cowboys? And you know what she said? No. No. Every single night, despite the boogeyman warning, I begged, until finally all the cowboys had finished all the cows, and all the extra cowboys they'd hired went to find work on another ranch, and there was just one cowboy left inside. And that night when I asked, oh, Mama Duck, can I sleep in the bunkhouse with the cowboy? You know what she said? No. Yes! Finally, I was getting to sleep in the bunkhouse like a real-life cowboy. And there I was in my jammies with the covers pulled up to my little chin, sleeping in the top bunk like a real-life cowboy, when all of a sudden there was this tap, tap, tap on the window. And when I turned and looked, there was the boogeyman's face in my face, and it glowed red and orange and yellow. And you know what I said? Ah! I slept in the very same bed as my grandmother, Mama Duck. In fact, it scared me so bad I forgot all about it for over 40 years, until finally one day I remembered. And I called my grandmother and I asked her, Mama Duck, do you remember a time when I was little and I wanted to sleep in the bunkhouse with cowboys? And she said, yes. I said, Mama Duck, did the boogeyman get me? And she goes, yes. It's like, Mama Duck, was that my Uncle John? And she goes, ha. He was a senior in high school, and she sent him out there to scare the snot out of me because little girls can't sleep in the bunkhouse with cowboys. You know what he did? Do you have a flashlight at home? Yeah. See if you can borrow one. Get the flashlight, go into the bathroom, shut the bathroom door, turn on the flashlight, turn off the bathroom light, look in the mirror, and hold the flashlight right here. Go, and there you'll see the boogie face I did. But the good thing about flashlights, besides finding your way around, you know what else you can use them for? Reading when you go to bed at night. Does anybody do that? Yeah, I used to do that all the time. Now I have a proper bookmark. Booklight. Anyway, so when you think about America, there's so many voices in America. And where I grew up in Texas, our state bird was the mockingbird. And this is a story from a neighboring state. And it said that mockingbird would fly across the land of the Navajo, and he could see far and wide. And as he looked far and wide, he noticed all of the other birds. And they all had brightly colored feathers. There were red feathers and blue feathers and green feathers and yellow feathers, and all of mockingbird's feathers were like shadows. They were gray. And he flew to a branch and he began to cry. And as he was crying, the spirit passed by and said, "Mockingbird, I cannot change your feathers, but I can give you a necklace filled with feathered beads. Each one of those beads contains a song, which you can share if you wish." The spirit was gone. Mockingbird looked down, and sure enough, there was a necklace filled with feathered beads. He pulled one off and broke it open, and the song came out, and he began to sing the first song so loudly, so beautifully, that every single bird gathered around him and said, "Whoa, what are you doing?" And he explained he was singing the first song. It was the most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. And they asked for him to sing it again and again, which he did. But then he realized he had all of these beads to share. And so one by one, he began to pass out all of his feathered beads. And each bird, when they got theirs, they broke it open and they began to sing their own song. And the whole world was filled with music. When Wren noticed that Mockingbird was not singing, and he went to Mockingbird and said, "Oh, Mockingbird, your song was so beautiful. Sing your song again." But Mockingbird could not. He had given away all of the feathered beads and had forgotten to keep one for himself. Wren tried to make Mockingbird take it back, but he said, "No, that was my gift to give. You keep that. It makes you too happy." Well, he told the other birds, and soon they all gathered. And each one of them trying to get him to take a feathered bead back, but he said no. And then they came up with an idea. Each one of them thought if they took just a little bitty part of their feathered bead and gave that to Mockingbird, then he would have a piece of their song, which they did. One by one by one. And that is why to this very day, Mockingbird is known as Zahaluni, which means bird of many voices. And it was because of his generosity so long ago. He does not have just one voice. He has a little piece of all the songs.